Hello. Hi there, everyone. Welcome to Pages. Behind the Pages. We are so excited to be here today for this conversation of Behind the Pages, conversations with leadership authors. And today we get to have a conversation with Dr. Marilyn Gist in celebration and honoring Black History Month. So this Behind the Pages series just started as a way to celebrate and to promote the diverse range of leadership authors that we have. And so for every Heritage Month, we actually create a new leadership book list to promote underrepresented authors. So this month, it's Black History Month. February is Black History Month. And so this is our 2023 list. And on this list, we have got nearly 200 books that include also memoirs, anything that is a leadership narrative. And so Dr. Gist, her book joined this list last year. And last year, the list was about 140 books, and now we're up to nearly 200. So we're really proud of that. Please do check out that list. And so today, I'm super excited and honored to get to have a conversation with my friend. We really became friends a few months ago. So new friend, Dr. Marilyn Gist. And I just got to So Dr. Gist is very humble, so I have to say this. So I'm just going to say that Google Scholar ranks her as #1 at Seattle University with over 15,000 citations of her published work. 15,000. That's a lot. That's 7 digits. And she is a school teacher and administrator, and has really interesting background before going back to school for her PhD. And for the past 30 years, she has helped lead MBA programs, not at just one school, but 2 schools. First at University of Washington and then at Seattle University. How many people can say they built MBA programs at 2 schools? So yes, really excited to be with you here today, with Dr. Gist today. And so the way this is going to work is I'm going to have some questions that get at understanding Dr. Gist's background, and then we'll have some time for audience questions. And you can use the chat window there to have those questions. And if you're just, I need to ask this now, then please put it in the chat. I may not notice it. The producer of Behind the Pages, Michaela, may actually have to say it out loud if a question's coming in and I'm not noticing it right away. And so let's just get started. Welcome, Marilyn Gist. And I first want to ask you, who are the role models for you for leadership when you were growing up?
Oh gosh, thank you. First of all, Julie, what an honor to be on your show and to be calling you friend. As you said, we've gotten closer in the last few months, but I had not expected to be on your show. So this is wonderful. Thank you. Growing up, I grew up in the South, and a couple of people who were very prominent at that time were Martin Luther King, obviously. And since this is Black History Month, I'll kind of focus on a couple of those leaders. And another one who had a very powerful impact on me was Thurgood Marshall, who became our first Black Supreme Court Justice. But those are 2 people I admired a lot. John F. Kennedy was another. Dating myself, but you've already mentioned I spent 30 years in universities. So it's been a long career, and I do go back a few decades before that. So those would be a couple of people that really pop for me.
What about role models in your personal life too?
My father, especially, and my mom. I was fortunate to be born into a very educated family. My father had his doctorate in organic chemistry, of all things, but I remember being 2 years old and 3 years old and being dragged up to the lab with him on Saturdays to give mom a break, and just really being immersed in university culture and university life. He was on the faculty. They both were at a couple of universities. And so just the role model of education and striving for excellence was just the environment for my world, and hugely impactful on how I turned out.
So growing up in an academic family, did you think you were going to be
Never.
academic?
Well, never in the sense of I wasn't pressured to do that, and I had never had any plans to go get a doctorate. About 2/3 through undergrad, I realized I'd flopped around to different majors, and couldn't settle on what I wanted to do, and finally realized you need to be able to get a job. So I ended up moving into education because there were several people in the broader family who were elementary school teachers. And I knew that that's something, I could get a job in. So that's kind of what started me down the path of education. And I did teach elementary school for 4.5 years and then moved into work for the government. We were in the DC area. So I moved into government procurement, moved on into management over time. And that's what got me interested in management and leadership. And I went back to get the doctorate in that field and go into higher ed.
So you said being a school teacher, being a government administrator, then as an academic, what is it about those jobs that really influenced your work? Like, is it?
Well, the first thing, I got in a management intern program when I was in my late 20s, and then took my first management job when I was about 30 and was not very good at it. I didn't understand that I needed to lead. In fact, I wrote a LinkedIn post on this that did well, where
I really like that one. Maybe you
where
could share that a little bit.
yeah, my mentor told me I was babysitting the job, that I was just going through the motions of doing what had to be done, but I wasn't doing an assessment of the needs and opportunities, and then taking the helm to really try to move the organization forward. It was a big aha. I was probably about 30, 28, 30 at that time. And then I left there and went to private industry for a couple of years while I was before I was in grad school, and I was not good at leading people. I really didn't get the humility bit. I had been driven, and I thought everybody should be driven. And so I tried to drive people. I was fairly critical, not very sensitive, and I discovered it didn't make people work harder or do more, but I didn't know what to do. And so I went back into education to teach, so I didn't have to lead people. But gradually, in working with exec MBA programs for years and seeing some excellent leaders, I began to get it. So
It takes a lot of humility to actually admit that you weren't very good. So yeah.
In fact, when I was hired by Seattle U specifically to lead a program, and I never mentioned this to them, my biggest worry was, I don't know that I'm any good at leading. I don't know that I'm good at leading people. And over the next decade, to build a program and take it to number 11 nationally we called ourselves a small and mighty team with a few resources. It only happened because I had kind of figured out how to lead people. And a lot of that was the humility bit, and just seeing how much you can galvanize people to rally around and do a lot when you treat them differently than I did when I was 30.
It makes me think about how we can learn on the job. As you were saying that, you didn't want to admit it, and you're just like, here, but I'm going to go in, and the risk that takes too, right? Just like, and I think that also probably some trust in yourself, like trust in, okay, I don't know how to do this.
And I went in self-aware. I went in mindful of my earlier failures and mindful of some of the things that hadn't worked. And I told myself, if you're going to take this job, you really have to prioritize getting good at leading people, because it's a fresh opportunity. It's been many years. You've grown up some, and maybe you can approach it differently. And I did from day one, and I stayed mindful of that, and it made a huge difference.
So I think it also shows that maybe we think that we don't know how to do something, and yet if we believe we can learn.
Yeah.
And now you're at this place where you are writing that you wrote this book with all of these all these really impressive people in the back saying all these wonderful things.
Yeah.
And you can see how much I read it here.
Wow.
Could you tell me what inspired you to write The Extraordinary Power of Leader Humility?
I was blessed to work with executive MBA students. So these are mid-career people who are doing well. And they come into my class and they come from a wide range of organizations. Many of the same organizations would send people every year, not dominating the class, but you'd get, a couple from Costco, a couple from Expeditors, a couple from Boeing, wherever. And I heard repeated comments from different years of students that were either praising the leaders of their companies or really saying harshly negative things about them. And I began to pay attention. What am I hearing?
Mm.
Why are they criticizing it? And then I began to make links to organizational performance. The ones who were coming in praising their leaders happened to work for organizations that were also doing amazing things. They had great cultures,
Mm.
longevity, a lot of employees who'd been there 25, 30, 35 years. People loved it. They put in lots and lots of time, extra time. And their performance, the organization's performance financially was off the charts. Whereas in places where people would say, our leaders don't walk the talk. They say employees are our most important asset, but they don't really believe that. And it looks good on my resume. I'm just here for 2, 3 years, or they're paying for my degree. And
I've
you know,
heard those.
when that's over, I'm out of there. Or in some cases, the companies would have a policy where you had to stay for a year or two afterwards or pay them back. As soon as that's over, I'm out of here. And when I would hear this repeatedly about certain companies and certain leaders, I knew they were in trouble. And I paid attention and realized their stock price was suffering. They were, struggling with their finances. They weren't growing. Their competition was getting ahead. So I really became aware, and that was part of what fueled the research on what is it that makes a difference. And ultimately, I zeroed in on the humility piece.
Mm. I also like how you were actually inspired by what your students were saying. You were hearing people. You were
Yeah,
listening and seeing those patterns.
yeah.
And I remember you said that, I mean, you wrote this book at a certain time, and that actually our our leadership of our country also inspired this book too. Can you share more about that?
Yes, I probably fall in a camp of people who was surprised at the 2016 presidential election results. And whether you were happy about that or not, one of the things it did for me was raise the question of what goes into good leadership, and doesn't that also apply to how we select people through our voting? And I realized that I knew a lot from having watched these leaders in companies and government organizations, and that I had the skills, I guess, to write about what goes into effective leadership, and to bring that out into the world. So that's why I wrote the book.
Mhm. And I know you also mentioned that that your background, that you growing up in the segregated South, also there was this theme of humility that also kind of influenced this. Can you share more about that?
Yeah, so I mentioned Thurgood Marshall as kind of a hero, a leader and a hero. And, as an African American, he was denied admission to University of Maryland College Park for law school, which happened to be where I got my degree, and later came full circle, realizing I was able to get a doctorate from a school that, a couple
Mm.
decades earlier denied him admission. But after he got denied there, he went to Howard, historically black college. I went to undergrad at Howard. He got his law degree there, went south to fight school segregation because it had affected him personally. And he worked with the NAACP a lot, finally got the Brown versus Board of Education case that he was able to take all the way to the Supreme Court, where the court came up with the decision that segregation is unconstitutional, and it sort of blew the system wide open. Prior, so there was about a 6 to 8 year gap between the time the Supreme Court passed down that precedent, though, and we made that national law with the Civil Rights Act. And in that window of time, I was in Norfolk, Virginia, in a segregated, I've always been in segregated schools, black schools, And my family pulled me out of an underperforming Black junior high school, seventh grade. I finished seventh grade there, and they got an attorney and petitioned the Norfolk, Virginia school system to have me admitted into our neighborhood public school, where I integrated for eighth and ninth grades. And I was one of two African American students integrating this rather large complex for 2 years. Very, very difficult experience, very hostile. But it was through that I had this up close and personal experience with what really makes humility in others essential, and that's my dignity. This little kid
Mhm.
standing on the playground that no one wanted to talk with, leaning against a wall, just counting the minutes till the bell would ring, or going into the lunchroom beforehand and not having any safe place to sit because the other kids didn't want you around. And really kind of understanding that there is this soft underbelly we have, this core sense of dignity that in so many ways in our world is not elevated to the extent that it should. And when people are in a leadership position and they have power, the way in which they interact with us can either support or hinder that dignity. So fast forward, I'm finishing my doctorate decades later and trying to figure out, what is this little Black kid from Tuskegee, Alabama doing getting this degree? The odds against that were huge. And I realized I had my parents, my leaders, as you mentioned, my role models to thank. But I also realized I had people like Martin Luther King to thank because they had pushed for civil rights, which ultimately gave me access to any public, whether it's a restaurant or housing or schools or whatever. I mean, it made discrimination illegal, but also I had the benefit of Thurgood Marshall's work, because if he hadn't blown that system open, we wouldn't have a Civil Rights Act. But also, I had been able to go to that junior high, which preserved my intellectual development and really was part of the reason why I was strong enough academically to later pursue a doctorate and end up getting it from a place that had denied him admission. And I often, in talking about this story, which I don't tell often, Julie, but I quote a line from there's a book by Wally Lamb called I Know This Much Is True. And he uses, you're at the tail end of 900 and some pages before you understand why he titled it. But he's pulling threads together at the end of the book. And he goes, I know this much is true. I know this much is true. Da, da, da. And then he finally says, one of them, I know this much is true. The evidence of God is found in the roundness of things. And I had
Mhm.
this aha moment when I was finishing my dissertation about I'm getting my degree from University of Maryland College Park. And it hit me that Thurgood Marshall couldn't get in there for law school. And then I saw the trajectory of his work and his life, and how his leadership, even though I never met the man, how his leadership had directly changed my trajectory. And there was just a huge roundness there where I was able to get my grad degree from a school that wouldn't admit him, even though we both were the same race.
Wow. That was so powerful. I'm feeling all these chills right
Yeah,
now.
anyway,
I'm
it's
feeling all
cool.
these chills because I mean, so my background is history. I'm trained as a historian. And so I think about legacy. I think
Yeah,
about what it means to be when we do something, it's not just for ourselves, it's for those who come after, and we
right.
don't know what that after will look like. He
Exactly.
didn't know that he was going to be opening up the doors for people to
Million,
get
yeah.
PhDs and degrees where he wasn't allowed. And also, I mean, just thank you so much for sharing the story of what it was like to go from being in a all Black school to an integrated school, and that very real firsthand experience of what does dignity mean because you were in that playground.
It was violated all day, every day. I mean, the name calling, bullying,
Wow.
yeah, it was really difficult emotionally for 2 years. But I wouldn't have gotten a doctorate years later if my folks hadn't done that, and we wouldn't have been able to do it without Marshall's work, Thurgood Marshall's work.
Did you appreciate it at the time?
No. I don't think I forgave my parents and appreciated until about the point I got the doctorate and realized, oh yeah, there was a purpose to this. It was actually really valuable.
I mean, it's the fact that they really pushed like that, like legally, that was,
Yeah.
and also that they knew how to do that.
That they knew how to do it. And,
Mhm.
the school system had no legal grounds for denying it, but they still threw up many roadblocks between, the petition the lawyer submitted and their final, okay, she can come. So, yeah, strange. Hard to believe that world was real, but it was.
It just makes us appreciate, sometimes we forget how much things have, sometimes it
Changed.
can be, "Oh, like, why aren't we changing fast enough?" It's like, actually, lots
We've
of things have
changed.
changed.
We need more change, but
Mhm,
some of us have also seen huge change.
mhm. So now, I love hearing that, your story there, because this is behind the pages, so we get to hear more about the author's story. Now, I do wanna give you an opportunity to read from your book,
Oh,
and this is the book excerpt part, and so, could you could you read the part that you selected to share with us?
okay. I need to put on glasses for this.
Mhm. Yes.
Thank you. So I'm going to read a couple of excerpts from chapter 1, which is titled Leading as Relationship. And one of the people I interviewed, one of the executives, was Roger Ferguson. He's African American, and at the time he was CEO of TIA, which is $1 billion financial service company. And he's a pretty amazing guy. But leading as relationship, and then Ferguson says, leadership is about inspiring people to do what's needed. If you look over your shoulder and no one's following you, you are not a leader. And then I go on, leadership requires working together. Being in relationship and working with others is how we make progress. And a leader's biggest challenge is to inspire in others their enthusiastic engagement with a shared goal, whether that's to launch a new product, advance an important cause, improve financial performance, or resolve global challenges. So, how can leaders work most effectively with others? When we think about factors that drive organizational performance, we tend to think about innovation, capital, strong competitive strategy. When we talk about motivating people, conversation typically turns to rewards and compensation. But largely unnoticed is leader humility, an extraordinarily powerful way of influencing those around you to volunteer their full support to achieving shared goals. Leader humility is a tendency to feel and display deep regard for others' dignity. We can still be strong and have high standards and still support other people's sense of self-worth. And then I talk about leadership as a container. Supporting others' dignity improves working together because it's the essential foundation for any healthy relationship. Leaders create the container for how work is done. A physical container is an object in which we hold, mix, or store something. And in a similar way, leaders create an environment or culture in which we do our work, the people, the processes, and the practices for how we interact. So, leader humility is the container for healthy relationships. And when you get that, people are willing to share, trust, go, as far as they can to get things done. And then I'm going to close by reading a segment here from another section called Creating Gracious Space.
Mm.
So, shining a light on this begins by putting ourselves in others' shoes. Think back to 3 questions that we'll talk about in a minute, Julie, that people have about leaders. It's who are you and where are we going and do you see me? And rather than relying on command and control to gain support or using fear and intimidation, some of the things I did when I was younger, Leaders with humility create a more gracious space for the dignity of others. And by understanding and honoring the needs of others, leaders with humility get more support because stakeholders are more engaged. How do they do this? The answer begins with recognizing that leaders are always being watched.
Mm.
What they say and do is scrutinized. Their behavior provides the evidence that answers the questions that other people have. So, my opinion of my own humility might be useful, but it's what you think of me that's going to determine how you behave. So, that's my excerpt.
Thank you so much for reading that. And I appreciate how you described that the role of leaders to create that container, to create that gracious space, to create that environment so that other people can thrive. So you interviewed 12 leaders of large organizations in your research. Could you share how you went about choosing these 12?
So it was mostly intentional and a little bit serendipitous in that when you're trying to reach people who are at that level in those types of organizations, getting on their calendar is a challenge. And sometimes months and months out, you may still not be able to do it. I knew when I knew that the book I wanted to write needed to illustrate that this works, that humility isn't a weakness or a meekness. It's not a failing for leaders. You can still be strong and be humble. But I wanted to show that with real life examples. And I knew that I couldn't do it with small companies that most people haven't heard of. When I think about the book's reach being international, I needed big brand names. And so I had either through students talking about leaders, for example, Jim Sinegal of Costco was co-founder, CEO for many, many years, and deeply revered by people in the company. So, and yet, I mean, here's this huge multinational company with a very humble CEO. So I thought, well, that is the type of example that I want. And so I went after big brand companies whose CEOs modeled this. And oh, by the way, the companies also had exceptional financial performance. So that's how I chose them. And in the process, I also wanted a sort of national representation. I didn't it's not half and half, but I think 7 of the companies were Seattle based because we just happen to be exceptional.
Yes.
But there were 5 companies or leaders of companies who were from elsewhere in the US.
So could you share an example of a story that you heard from one of these leaders that's one of your favorite anecdotes? I know you have a lot of them in the book.
I do have a lot of them.
So just one.
Just one. Okay. Um, I think the one that probably pops for me is listening to people talk. I mentioned Jim Sinegal, but listening to people talk about why it was they had so much reverence for him. And he's sort of a dry personality, a little on the gruff side when you talk to him. He's not this warm, fuzzy teddy bear, but people loved him. But some of the stories I heard were Jim didn't have a reserved parking space, even though he was CEO of this global company. He just didn't believe in that. People would talk about seeing him walk through one of the warehouses and notice a piece of paper on the floor and pick it up and, not ask someone else to do it. I asked him about that once and he said, well, I think 80% of leading is teaching. You have to show the way. You have to show people. And what he does is by picking up paper, he's saying, I care about how our store looks to other people. And so you model that. He didn't believe in advertising. Costco grew as big as it did because his philosophy is just be humble, put a basic description out of the product on a sign and a price, and the customer's gonna, if there's value, they'll buy it. And if they think it's not worth it, they won't buy it. So that kind of humility, just during one of the recessions, one of the managers in my course said, this isn't very public, but Jim would come into our business meetings and he would say, are you keeping an ear out for how employees are doing? Because if you hear someone's really struggling, come talk to us. We have resources that can
Mm.
help them. We can give them, for example, discounts on gas or, you know, money to help pay the rent. He said, just let us know, keep an ear out and let us know how our team is doing. So his humility just showed up in that kind of way. And that's just one example. I'd say all 12 of them did it in similar kinds of ways, although unique to their circumstance.
Yes, and I just appreciated how many stories that you had in the book, because it's, I mean, going back to it's about teaching the role modeling. So let's talk about, I know you have this framework for leader humility, and first I'm going to start with, what is humility?
So I define it behaviorally, and I look specifically at do we feel and show deep regard for other people's dignity? And I use regard more than respect because I think regard has more of a reverence to it, almost an emotional tone. So we have to show regard for other people's dignity. It's not just something we can say, and it's hard to fake. That's why I add this dimension of feeling in.
Hmm. And then what is dignity?
So dignity is your sense of self-worth. So you may be familiar, an Asian context might be face, the
Hmm.
way many Asian cultures look at preserving face of the person you're interacting with. It's a very similar thing. Their sense of self-worth that you don't want to do or say anything to embarrass them or offend them personally. I use an analogy of an invisible backpack. So I have one, you have one, everybody has an invisible backpack that kind of to me represents our sense of worth or dignity. And I don't know what's in yours, and you don't know what's in mine. But it's filled with everything from our life experience and our belief system that we have some strong feeling about. And much of that would be pride, but it could also be shame. It could be things that make us very proud or positive about what we have or have done, or things we might feel some guilt or shame around. So, for example, not everybody looking at me has known that I'm African American. And occasionally I'll hear people making disparaging comments about African Americans. That hits my dignity because that is my community. And whether they see that in me or not, I know about this little girl growing up as a young Black child in a segregated South, and I have this lived experience. So it's in my backpack, it's invisible, but it's real. And when I hear those disparaging comments or they're made directly to me, my dignity takes a hit. And so I have some pride about my race, my gender, my nationality, where I live, my family. I mean, all these other things, some of the hobbies and activities I've been in over time. And everybody does. And everybody has a sense of dignity and needs to have that sense of self-worth. And so leaders tend to have influence and power, and a part of leadership is relationship. And if we violate other people's sense of dignity, even though we don't know what's in that backpack, we know there is a backpack. And if we aren't careful with that, if we keep bumping into it or knocking it off, you've just lost somebody. They'll go through the motions if they have to have the paycheck, but they're not going to like you. They're not going to want to go to the bat for you or to do anything extra.
Thank you for, I love analogies. So I'm thinking about as you're saying this, what's in my invisible backpack. Thank you for sharing with me and with us how you feel when people don't recognize your race and then make disparaging comments. And and what's in your backpack. And I actually asked the audience to think about what's in your invisible
Yeah.
backpack.
Yeah. I mean, a big one now is, regardless of how you might feel about it, is the trans issue, and and people who have a sense of self-worth and want to be respected and honored for that. Um, and it's almost less important to me whether someone knows what race I might be or everything about me than how they treat me. And if they
Mm-hmm.
treat me with that regard for whatever might be in that backpack, then that's okay, you
Mm-hmm.
know?
So you have these prime questions that people have of leaders, and this is the framework, and we're going to get to see these questions, and you'll talk through them. And also, this is when I'm asking the audience start to think about questions you want to ask Dr. Gist, and you can put that into the chat message. So, what are these? What are these questions?
So when we think about a new boss, if someone says you're going to have a new boss, think about what pops for you. And immediately there's certain nervousness that we have. We want to know, well, who is this person really? So one of the questions is, who are you? We want to know what are they going to ask of me? What direction are they going to set? Am I going to have to learn new skills? Are they going to take away the things I like doing that are fun? Or where are we going, basically, is another question. And then the third question is, do you see me? Am I somebody who matters to you, or am I just sort of a cog in the wheel and you think of me as just here to do a job and, shut up and get it done kind of thing? So these are three powerful questions that we have of all leaders, and we don't typically ask them. We're wondering about them when we first hear about a new president who's been elected, or a new representative at the city level that's been elected, or a new boss that's coming into the organization, whether that's CEO or immediately above this. We want to know, who are you, where are we going, and do you see me? And leaders, because we don't usually ask, leaders answer these questions by how they act, how they behave, and they answer in parallel ways. So my character as a leader is going to basically show up pretty quickly, and you're going to figure out who I am by things you see me do or hear me say. It's like the Jim Senegal picking up paper off the
Mm.
floor, or not having a reserved parking space. Jeff Musser of Expeditors is one of my interviewees, and he said, we expect all our executives to pay for parking just like all the employees do. So that's kind of a character values thing that people get when they decide who the leader is. Where are we going is one that we show by the direction that we set. Eventually, we're going to come out and say, here is the new goals that we have, or the new market we want to enter. Here's the strategy we're going to use to get there. And so once we set that direction, people have a sense of where we're going. And then the last question, the do you see me, comes out in, how do I treat you? Do I really treat you in a way that shows deep regard for your dignity? And or do I step all over it, or knock your backpack all over the room? So those are the three questions, and kind of the way we make inference from watching leaders' behaviors. And then, Michaela, if you would pull up the next slide, I'll talk briefly about the 6 keys to leader behavior. This is the core model for the book. And so you can see, leader humility affects others' dignity. And then your 3 questions and the ways that we answer it are in that center row. And then below that are what I call 6 keys. These are sets of behaviors that have proven to be the most important in how a leader shows up around each of those questions. So for the who I am piece, the main things are, is my ego in balance, or am I arrogant? Am I someone who's condescending to you, or very boastful about myself? In which case, that's not a very good thing if you're leading people. What about my integrity? Can you trust me to walk the talk? Do you believe what I say? So having integrity is really important. Those are the 2 biggest ones when we want to know who a leader is. In terms of direction, it's about having a compelling vision and ethical strategies. And by compelling, something that's really serving the greater good. people get jazzed about working for something that has a noble purpose. And a lot of leaders could do more with this by elevating the sort of basic tasks under an umbrella of here's why it's important, here's how it's going to have an impact on other people's lives in a favorable way. And then in some other cases, maybe the leaders need to really think about, should we be doing what we're doing, because that direction's not very wholesome. And then ethical strategies. I can remember in one of my early management jobs being asked by one of the vice presidents in the company to go, and I had worked with the government, go over there and try to get some confidential information that would help the company win this multi-million dollar proposal. And I said, well, that's illegal. And he turned around and he looked at me and said, well, don't forget who's paying your check these days. And he was explicitly saying that I should go do something illegal because I now worked for this company. So that's an example of not an ethical strategy. And I was young at the time, and I just fudged and didn't do it and made some excuses about not being able to get the information. Whereas today, I'd probably just come out and say, no, and here's why, and, move on. And then in terms of how I treat you, the two big buckets are generous inclusion. And, Julie, with inclusion, we talk about that a lot in the diversity, equity, inclusion space. But I mean this much more broadly. This is about including all of your stakeholders, so your customers, your board members, your vendors, supply chain, your employees, and on and on. All of these are stakeholders. And when you're leading, if you're going to make a decision that is going to have an impact on stakeholders of any type, particularly if you expect they're not going to like that, you need to generously include those people, like figuratively pick up the phone and say, I've got to make a decision. It's going to have an impact. I'd like to get your input on this. And then maybe you're not able to do what they would like, but at least you've consulted them. If you've signaled up front that you may not be able to integrate everything, but you still want their input, and if you're someone whose integrity is good, they'll tend to believe that. So including people before decisions are made, getting their input is what I mean by inclusion. And then developmental focus is about having an openness to caring for somebody's longer term goals and aspirations, and not thinking of them just as, well, I've hired you just to do this job, so don't look for anything else. Employees are there hopefully for a longer period of time, and many of them want to develop beyond the current job. And so leaders who are open to doing that show more humility, more respect for their dignity. And the same thing is true with your vendors, can be true for your customers. Are you helping to make connections for them that support, their larger developmental needs? So those are what I call keys to leader humility, the 6 keys, and that's a framework for the book.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate how the questions are coming from my perspective and other people's perspectives. It's just it shows how we're in this container that we're in. We are all seeing things differently, and how do we get at those different perspectives? So I want to see, Michaela, are there questions? Okay, here we go. I love your focus on humility as the basis for effective and empathetic leadership. How do you suggest we go about growing in humility?
So the book has a number of how-tos and recommended behaviors at the end of most chapters, so that would be a good place to start. I also have developed some pretty rigorous self-assessment tests that are not high in price, and you can buy those through my website. They give you, and they're mapped to the book. It's a good companion for the book. So you can take the test and get a benchmark against a national population of, how humble are you? Now, this is self-report, so you have to kind of be honest, but it's a really good way of highlighting, well, I'm good in this, I'm not so good in that. and then maybe zeroing in on those areas of the book to figure out more of what you need to do and following some of those suggested behaviors and tips. There's a chapter in the book on how humility is developed, where I kind of aggregate across the dozen people I interviewed, and I found some common themes that help develop it. You know, being marginalized, like I was, tends to, for many people, have that humility once they're grown, because they remember having been marginalized, so they don't want to do that to other people. Having had some difficult experiences, you know, I interviewed Phyllis Campbell, whose family had been in the internment camps during World War II, where they lost everything. They lost the family store, they lost the property, because the U.S. just rounded up every Japanese American or Japanese immigrant and basically took everything away from them. So having had those difficult experiences tends to also develop humility. If you haven't had that, befriend people who have, listen. I think none of us has a corner on diversity. We all have an opportunity to learn from each other, and learning about the path that someone else has taken helps me develop empathy for others and be mindful of the need to regard their dignity.
Thank you so much, Dr. Adeola for your question. And I love the point about how leaders answer those questions by their actions and behavior, walk the talk. Thank you. Thanks, Judy Lee. Any other questions? Also, Michaela, could you flash the assessment in case we have a QR code for that. So, Dr. Gist, what are you working on now?
Some related work. The one that's probably most closely related to this is what I call leader morality. So as I started to look at how people answer some of these questions, and I think about things like ethical strategies, developmental focus, I realized there's something more going on. And I began to realize that if you're truly humble, if you truly support others' dignity, it's broader than that. And that's led me into an article that's coming out this summer in Leader to Leader called The Case for Leader Morality. But for example, I've expanded to thinking about humility is not just about respecting your dignity, Julie. It has to be regard for the ecosystem you're in. Because how can I really show regard for someone's dignity if I don't also support their need for education, their need for housing, if I don't think about the fact that we all share and need clean air, clean water, so the planet. So when we think about what it takes to really regard someone's self-worth, we have to start thinking not just the individual, but the larger ecosystem that person is a part of, because all of us are, right? None of us exists in isolation. And then, so I think about it in terms of the greater good. And then as I began to look at what flows from that, I realized that moral virtues are very important. And one of those is honesty. We have to be honest about what are we doing in organizational leadership. Is it really supporting the dignity of others or not? I'll give a quick example here. I did a LinkedIn post a week or so ago about I got a call from a tech executive asking about coming layoffs, and in the conversation, he wanted my opinion about what did I think about this new wave of giving people notice of layoff by email, because it saves the emotional discussion, saves time. Didn't I agree? And I said, no, I don't. I think this is an issue of self-worth. This is about human dignity. I mean, when you hire people, do you do that by email, or do you actually have a face-to-face conversation? And so, I mean, I've had conversations with, software engineers who put 20, 24 years in a company and then learned that their job's been eliminated by email. Just go in to log in one morning and get the notice that, this is your last day. come get your, attached is your letter notifying you of your severance pay. And by the way, in 30 minutes, we're going to lock you out of your electronic accounts. That's just not showing regard for dignity, in my view. And I think the view of most of those people who've been laid off that way. So I think rigorous honesty, are the people who are doing that being honest with themselves about employees are our greatest asset? Or are they thinking about, how do I appeal just to shareholders by saving a few extra bucks? And then I think moral courage is another really powerful one. And that's the courage to make decisions and take action that serves the greater good, not just the shareholders, for example. So working on leader morality, and the article has been accepted for Leader to Leader to come out in their summer issue. So I'm kind of excited to see what sort of response we get to that. And then the last new thread is I have done some research, we did some research we finished last year in looking at leadership advancement. And I was interested in seeing how humility played out for that. I was curious about whether there would be differences for men or women, Julie, because we often think women are better at this than men. Well, not so much. Yes, by about 10%, but there's a lot of women who aren't good at it, a lot of men who are. So we don't have the runaway win on that one. But what I did find were there were some other competencies that made a difference in how women get promoted, but they don't make a difference for men. And so I have developed an assessment tool, and I'm building some community around women's leadership advancement because there's things that women need to do that we don't necessarily understand, that we're not doing, and that are important for us to get ahead if we want to do that.
So, Dr. Gist, I can already see how, and just what you were saying about what you're working on next, that why you are according to Google Scholar, the #1 scholar, because you are so prolific in all of this. And so and also, you've mentioned your LinkedIn audience. Please subscribe, follow Dr. Marilyn Gist on her LinkedIn. She has these really helpful and specific. I mean, I really appreciate how specific you are in your stories. There's sometimes people who just know these generalities, and you go in and you give such interesting examples. So do follow Dr. Gist on LinkedIn as well, and also get the book. And so, here are details about the book. Again, I'm a big fan. See,
thank you. It's really got it marked. Yeah.
And you can stay in touch and check out that assessment tool. And thank you so much, Dr. Gist, for this time. Thank you to everyone who has engaged today in this conversation. And please remember to subscribe to the Curiosity Base newsletter so that you can stay in touch with our next episode of Behind the Pages. And with that, thank you.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you, Dr. Pham. It's been wonderful. Michaela, too. Thank you.